Hi, welcome to another Retronaut video. So in the last chapter of this series, looking at my tech history, we took a look at the Quadra 700 and we also took a look at my own personal Quadra 950. That machine was primarily used as a Photoshop graphical workstation back in the day. And in this chapter, we're going to take a look at a machine which I actually owned. I didn't ever actually own a Quadra 700 back in the day. So yeah, that might be a bit more interesting maybe. So in 1993, I'd finished my degree course at Birmingham City University. My degree culminated in a degree show, and I'm not sure if you've ever seen one of these. It's probably pretty unlikely. But basically what happens is at the end of the degree, you put up a bunch of boards and then you obviously pin your work onto it. In my case, I also put up a pedestal and I put my Amiga 1500 on it and I showed some multimedia work on it and animations, which I'd rendered in 3D. We talked about this in a previous video. Now, I was a little bit naive as to the main reason for having the show. I thought it was actually for the people that come in and actually mark the degree. It's the course directors themselves that actually award the score that you get, the degree level that you get, but then it's moderated by a moderator. And I thought that the course, the show was mainly for the directors to look at your work and to evaluate you, and then for the moderator. But the main reason I think actually they had a show was to actually act as a shop window for your work, because what they want you to do when you finish the degree is to go and get a job. They're not trying to train you how to be graphic designers for you to go and get a job, working as an estate agent or something like that. They want you to go and do graphic design. So anyway, I wasn't in college anymore and I had to wait around really and to see what would happen next. And this was a great time actually. It was a little bit strange because I had no money. I was kind of starving. I remember having to actually go to the college and ask for money for food because I literally didn't have any food to eat. And yeah, that was a bit tough. But at the same time, I was living with some people and a couple of them were actually working. They had paid jobs and they would quite often ask me to go out and have a drink with them. I always believe in, what goes around comes around. And I thought, well, maybe I'll be able to do that for them in the future. So I accepted and we enjoyed a few drinks together and it was good fun. Meanwhile, there were sort of cogs turning behind the scenes, which I wasn't really aware of. And a couple of different pairs of visitors who actually came to the degree show, they were interested in me. So the course directors got in touch with me and they told me that Cadbury Schweppes, which is a famous chocolate and sweet maker in the UK, and Schweppes is a drinks maker, that they were interested in me working for them. So I headed down to Bourneville, which is a small village. It's within southern Birmingham, as I recall. And it's a model village, actually. Cadbury's was a Quaker factory, as far as I know, back in the day. And they actually built the village for their factory workers to live in. I think it was actually the original site for the factory as well. And the village, Bourneville, it actually lends its name to one of their bars of chocolates, dark chocolate, as I remember, which is a bit of a favorite of mine. I can remember getting off the train and heading towards the factory and the air literally smelled of Cadbury's chocolate eclairs, which I found quite funny. It honestly felt like I was sort of visiting Willy Wonka's own factory, except this was actually real. And yeah, there was even a little village there for the workers to live in. So I had the job interview and it went well, and it was to actually design labels for Schweppes, I think, as I recall. But I assumed that maybe, a little bit further down the line, I would also get to maybe work on Cadbury's chocolate wrappers. And I thought, that was pretty cool. So left the interview, I was pretty positive about it and I waited to see what would happen. So a few days later, and the course directors called me again. I actually thought it might have been something to do with the Cadbury's interview, but it turned out that there was another group of people from ICL in Reading, and they had visited the show as well. So I'm not sure if you've heard of ICL, but ICL was the kind of equivalent of IBM in the UK back in the 1960s and onwards. I think it was originally made up of a number of different companies, but it had been conglomerated together, I think, by the government. They'd induced these companies to join together to form a larger company to have some kind of competition with IBM. By the early 90s, when I was interested in it, it was mainly making Windows-based PCs, and it was also making Linux systems. But I think it also sold, these mini computer and mainframe computers, but that wasn't something I was aware of really. So one of their team, Kevin, I remember he was a goth. He had long black hair. He only wore black. He always used to be quite smart, actually. Black shirt, black jeans, but yeah, only ever black. He was a really nice guy. He told me during the interview that he was actually producing 3D graphics, which was being used to try and sell ICL PCs. And he said that he personally felt that they probably needed to get somebody with design skills. He was able to use the software, but he didn't think he was strong enough in terms of design and art ability to actually, get the most out of it. So this kind of left me with a dilemma. That interview went well, and I was thinking to myself, do I go and work for Cadbury's, which was a very well established company, probably a guaranteed job for life, or do I go and work for ICL? Well, to be fair, ICL was a pretty established company as well. But in their favor, they did have this feature of the job, which was that I would have to learn 3D Studio and then use that to produce animations and other 3D graphics for their products. My feeling was that, 3D had more of a scope to eventually maybe lead to video games. Video games was something I was really interested in working in. So, I would have loved to have worked in that field. So I thought, well, it looks like the ICL job is going to be a better fit for me. After the interview, I waited for a while to see what would happen. It took a couple of days, actually, and then eventually they got back to me and they said that they did actually want to me to start working there. So that was fantastic news. I obviously would have to move from Birmingham down to Reading to where their office was. But that would mean I would have to learn 3D Studio, which was really fantastic. I mean, to be paid to learn a 3D application just seemed like a dream, really. I did a little bit of reading up about 3D Studio, and I found out it was an IBM-based 3D modeler and renderer. It was only available on the IBM PC, I think ever, actually. But it was a scanline renderer. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but it basically meant that it rendered much more quickly than real 3D at a trade-off of quality. So yeah, I made preparations to head down to Reading, and a short while later, I was heading down there. So I managed to get, it was a room actually in a house, just the small bedroom in a house to rent. And the landlords told me that they were a suburb of Reading and that it was a short distance from there to the main office. So that sounded pretty good. A friend of mine in the house, Ollie, who unfortunately, I don't remember his surname. I would love to remember it so I could maybe try and reach out to him, but that information has just gone with the wind. But he was very kind, and he took me down in his car and I moved into this house. So subsequently, it turned out that my new landlord wasn't quite telling the truth. I was living in Wokingham, which is a small town, which is about 15 minutes away from Reading on a train. So that's okay. It's only a short ride in on the train. But what they'd really forgotten to tell me was that their house was about 30 minutes walk away from the train station in Wokingham. So yeah, that was really naughty of them. Getting to the train 30 minutes, coming back from the train 30 minutes, and then on top of that, the train ride. But anyway, altogether it was about 45 minutes commute, so it wasn't too bad. Honestly, at the time, looking back, I think, I was pretty much paid a pittance by ICL. I'm assuming they didn't have much of a budget, so, they paid me what they could. But I had very few debts. I had a very small student loan when I was in college. There was a reason why I was starving at the end of the course. I just didn't spend much money. I tried to focus any sort of savings that I had, on my equipment, the Amiga 1500, for instance, that we talked about in previous videos. I had very few outgoings in this house. The rent was very cheap. I didn't really eat much in the evenings. And from what I recall, ICL actually had a subsidized canteen. So food was actually included in my job. So I think I could have breakfast there and I could also have dinner. So soon my money started to accrue and I pretty much had some money burning a hole in my bank account after a pretty short time, really. And I remember around this time, the Amiga 4000 had been launched by Commodore. So as you'll know from previous videos in this series, I was a serious Amiga fan, and I was pretty much by this point a hardcore Amiga user. I'd owned an Amiga 500 from 1987 until 1991, and then I'd upgraded that machine to a big box Amiga, an Amiga 1500. So this 4000, it was a new generation of Amiga from Commodore. It had been a long time coming, and it had the new AGA chipset. So this chipset gave it Super VGA-like graphics, and it was also a very attractive machine. It had a really nice design, I thought anyway. So again, I bundled up what I could of my Amiga 1500, and I put an advert in a newsagent's in Reading, and I waited to see if I would get a nibble. Once I did, and the Amiga 1500 was sold, I ordered an Amiga 4000, and you can imagine how happy I was when it arrived. It was a little crazy, really, because I was living in, basically a box, and at the same time, I had the ultimate Amiga. I mentioned Super VGA. What exactly does that mean? In 1987, IBM released a video standard for the IBM PC called VGA. And this was, as far as I remember, the last standard they actually controlled. So this graphics standard offered two killer display modes. One was 320 by 200 pixels with 256 colors. And the second was 640 by 480 in 16 colors. Now, okay, 320 by 200 may sound like a very low pixel resolution by today's standards. But back at the end of the 80s and the early 90s, this was actually still a standard resolution in video games. And of course, the 256 colors meant that you could produce some really attractive pixel art. It wasn't unlimited in the number of colors, but it gave you enough colors that you actually have a decent palette to do pretty much anything looking, pretty good. And this became the defining look of PC games towards the end of the 1980s. PC games started to look basically better than Amiga games. That higher resolution, it only offered 16 colors, but again, you've got to bear in mind that back in the late 70s, it was only the Apple II that actually offered any colors at all. Well, anything more than two. The Apple actually supported 4 colors, which, let's face it, isn't a lot. But it took until the early 80s for the PC to come out, and when it was released, it actually only had 4 colors as well. Over time, of course, on the PC, you had the EJ standard, and I think that offered 16 colors, again at quite low resolution. And so, in 1987, that high resolution of 640 by 480 with 16 colors, it wasn't great in terms of the number of colors, but it was actually quite cool for certain games because the higher resolution allowed you to do certain games where the pixel density was more important than the number of colors. So a few years later in 1989, Super VGA was proposed by Visa. And this was actually where IBM just completely lost control, really, of the PC. They didn't even get to suggest the graphics standards anymore. So because of this, Super VGA was more of a loose standard, and it was not actually ratified at first. In fact, over time, SVGA was added to sort of piecemeal. So it was quite a strange standard in that the standard kept on changing, basically. But at first, you had modes like 800 by 600 in 16 colors. So obviously, that's significantly better than VGA. And even more sexily, you had 640 by 480 in 256 colors. So now you had that fantastic 256 color palette, but in higher resolution. By the early 90s, SVGA was unleashing more and more resolutions and modes. So you had 800 by 600 in 24-bit color, which was pretty exciting. And you even had all the way up to 1280 by 1024 in 24-bit color. This may all sound, of course, very peachy, but you've got to bear in mind that to get those modes, you had to buy a much more expensive graphics card and a much more expensive monitor. And generally, those are only available to those using PCs professionally. If you were gaming, the Super VGA modes were generally out of reach, but 640 by 480 in 256 color, that became something of a standard, as I remember it. Anyway, let's get back to the Amiga 4000. My new Amiga 4000 was a 68030. And as I said earlier, it had the new AGA chipset, which meant that it had basically Super VGA graphics. Although it had taken a while to arrive, that chipset, as I said, now brought the Amiga up to the same spec basically as a PC. I'd wanted to get the newer 68040 CPU, which the 4000 supported, but the problem was that it was very expensive. I think, from what I recall though, the 68030 that I had in my Amiga 4000 was actually faster than the one that I had in the 1500. So that was a slight speed bump as well. So what were my first impressions of the Amiga 4000? Well, I can remember buying Doom 2 by Westwood Studios and playing that in Super VGA. And, well, the Amiga's version of Super VGA, and I must admit it was really, really impressive. Because of the 68030, it was very sprightly, and the machine had, I think, a much nicer industrial design than the Amiga 2000. All in all, it was a great machine. However, if I had a crystal ball, then I would have known at that time that the 68000 was starting to stall. I don't know why this happened, but it looks like there was something about the design of the 68000 architecture that meant that it was starting to fall behind the increasing updates that Intel were releasing for the 486. At this point, the 68040 was actually faster than the 486 chips, which were out at the time. It felt like it was a better architecture, but over the next couple of years, it became clear that the 68040 just didn't scale as well as the 486 did. Apple, I know, was aware of this, and in the next couple of years, they would also try to get off the 68000 range of chips. The Quadra, as I said in my previous video, was the last big hurrah for that range of chips, the 68000, in the Apple range, and in the future, they moved over to using the PowerPC range of chips. So on the IBM PC, Wolfenstein 3D had fast 3D gameplay. It provided a new first-person viewpoint to the game. And of course, this made you feel like you were in the action. This has become one of the most standardized viewpoints that we have in modern games. But back in the early 90s, it was extremely exotic and compelling. So you can imagine that this quickly outmoded older 2D games, which used a top-down view, or if they were being exciting, they might have an isometric view. But you were always looking down or in on the action. You weren't actually in the middle of it. And that's why these type of games fared badly compared to first person. So to make matters worse for the Amiga, Wolfenstein and its later technological sequel Doom used a graphic architecture called chunky pixels, and the Amiga didn't support it. It had a system called planar graphics, and this just wasn't actually suited to displaying a game technology like Doom. And, Doom was basically super hot in the early 90s. So the Amiga started to look a little bit old hat. There was this revolution that was going on in 3D gaming, first-person gaming with Doom. Everybody on the PC was having an amazing time with it. And unfortunately, this lack of chunky pixels on the Amiga, it became a bit of an Achilles heel for it, really. And it meant that, the Amiga platform couldn't really join the Doom party. Let's talk about my job. This was actually my first real job ever, and it involved me making 3D animations, as I said earlier, using 3D Studio. A perk of that job as well, at least for me, as a techie person, was that I literally had to learn how to use and take apart and then reassemble IBM PCs, at least the ones that ICL produced. This was required in case we had to build a PC, a specific PC build for a show, or if there was a problem with one of the machines that we were going to demo. We had to easily take these machines apart and rebuild them to configure them to, be usable at a show. I can vividly remember being given an audio tape explaining how PCs worked, and then that evening I was lying in bed with my Walkman on, and the tape was explaining to me about 386 processors and the newer 486 CPUs from Intel. And it explained about isobuses and how much bandwidth they had, and the new Visa local bus, which was a higher bandwidth bus for graphics card and storage. So it was all pretty exotic, but I very quickly became familiar with this alien technology, and I understood how to build a PC from parts, which was really cool. That's always been a skill which I've used from then on. Soon enough, I had my own IBM PC. My boss, David, he told me that ICL were selling off all kit. Apparently they did this from time to time, and that we could all put bids on basically machines that we wanted to get. I remember I did a bit of a spread bet. I couldn't afford to buy loads of them, but I did put my name down for a number of machines. What I actually ended up getting was an old 486 and an even older 386 server, which I think was running at something like, I think the 486 was running at 25 megahertz, which would have made it pretty slow for the day. I have no idea what the 386 was running at. Yeah, but basically both machines were, on the edge of obsolescence, and definitely the 386 was. The 386 was an absolute monster. It was a massive machine, and it was about the same size as the Quadra 950 that we looked at in the previous video. What I remember really vividly was opening it up when I got it back home, and inside I found these really massive full-length expansion cards, ISA cards, and each one of these was a memory expansion, I worked out. And what was funny was it took 4 of these cards to give that server 4 megabytes of RAM, which at that time really wasn't a lot of memory. It was funny because, I obviously had to bear in mind that when this 386 server was built, that amount of memory was obviously a massive amount of memory. But by the time I got it, it wasn't even good enough for really a desktop PC. And that 386 would have definitely struggled to play Doom. I think we did try it out, me and my friend, but it actually, it ran it as, it had to be in a tiny window and it really wasn't up to the job. I decided to give that 386 to a friend of mine. And if you watched all my videos, you may remember my Commodore 64 period and the fact I had a friend and I used to pop over his house and play on his ZX Spectrum. So that same friend I decided to give this machine to. But obviously, looking back, it was such a chunk. It was such a robust design. I've never seen anything like it since then. I had no room in my little bedsit. I was in a single bedroom. By this point, I think I was actually living in Reading. I'd moved from Wokingham into Reading. And I was actually in an even smaller room. So yeah, I had nowhere to fit like a 386 tower server. So yeah, if there are any ICL, ex-employees, I think ICL closed down a few years ago and the name is now Fujitsu. So if any of them are watching this video and you do have an old 80s or 90s ICL PC tucked away at home, maybe in your loft, and you want to get rid of it, then please reach out to me and I would definitely love to get an ICL PC. It's something I'd love to have for my collection because, it was an important part of my tech journey, really. Let's get back to my job. I was making my 3D demos using 3D Studio from Autodesk. This was the original incarnation of 3D Studio Max, if you've ever heard or seen or even used that piece of software. And it was, for me anyway, it was really a leap ahead compared to Real 3D on my Amiga. I don't think the comparison is necessarily fair because it cost, I think, £2,000 for it at the time. And I've seen pictures of the development team and I think it was like a 6 or 7 man team, whereas I think Real 3D might have been developed by one person. Anyway, I remember its modeler was much more capable and fluid to use than Real 3D. It didn't use a solid paradigm, it used polygons, and I had to get used to that. But once I got used to it, it had these core tools of lathing, lofting, and extruding shapes. It had a very capable spline editing system, and once you'd edited those splines, you could then rotate them around on a long paths to make shapes. And yeah, it was a really good modeler for the time. Back then, it was definitely a jump forward, at least compared to Real 3D. 3D Studio was a scanline renderer. Now, what that means is that it just basically didn't use ray tracing at all. Instead of ray tracing, it used bitmaps as its core technology for producing the kind of effects that you would actually use ray tracing for. So rather than ray tracing shadows, it would use a faster technique to render out, which was a very similar technique to ray tracing, except it would then store the result of that in a bitmap, which it would then project from that camera. And these are called shadow maps. And they've been used in video games up until very recently, actually, where we started to transition over into using ray tracing. Reflection maps use a very similar idea. You do a render from a certain point in the scene, you put that into a bitmap, and then you use that as the reflections on surfaces. And that is obviously much faster than doing ray tracing. So these maps were often rendered on the first frame of your animation if nothing moved. 3D Studio would do an analysis of your scene, and if nothing physically moved in your scene, then it could basically render those shadow maps and just reuse them on every other frame. It didn't have to keep on doing those calculations. If you had a reflection map, it very often didn't have to render that at all. That would just be read in from disk and used. So that was something you would generally prepare beforehand, and sometimes you'd have to download these reflection maps from the internet or get them on floppy disks, which was much more likely at this time because it was actually quite difficult to download things. The internet, World Wide Web wasn't really public at that point. Another thing that you had with scanline technology is that you could use sampling on those bitmaps, and you could then blur them artificially. And that actually looked better when you were doing things like shadows, because when you did ray trace shadows, they were so slow to calculate that it couldn't do anything more than one sample. And it was the same thing with reflections and refractions. And that meant that ray tracing in Real 3D always looked very pixelated. It's something I'd like to try and do at some point, is to go back to Real 3D and see if I can actually produce a render with it, which actually has some anti-aliasing. And I've got an idea how I could do that. I could do like a little animation with a camera and just move it around and then combine those images together. And that actually would give a form of anti-aliasing. So that might be interesting to try that out in a future video. But anyway, back then I didn't have time to be doing that kind of thing. So, reflection maps were super fast. They weren't as accurate as ray tracing, but they actually did look pretty good. And I would say the only real major downside to scanline renderers was that they weren't very good at producing thick glass. Things like glasses, drink glasses, or bottles, clear glass bottles. They rely on a phenomenon called refraction. And that's the way that light transmits through a surface and gets bent. The light gets bent by the surface, the index of refraction. And this gives us the very particular look of glass. At least, curved thick glass, where as you look through the glass, what you see beyond the glass is distorted by the bending of the light. You'll probably recognize this in video games because, as I said, video games use scanline technologies. And what this meant was that glasses, bottles and wine glasses and things like that in a video game would tend to look like they were made out of basically thin plastic, like they were a kind of plastic bubble. So, that was probably the worst thing really about scanline renderers. They really sucked at doing glass. But there we go. Everything else was actually not too bad. And you could actually use the extra processing that you got from not ray tracing, and you could lavish that extra CPU that you had on providing higher quality sampling of the bitmap for shadow maps and reflection maps, and also the actual pixels that you render. So that was something I noticed was a big difference between Real 3D and 3D Studio, was the images that came out of 3D Studio looked a lot cleaner because they had pretty decent anti-aliasing compared to, well, there wasn't any on Real 3D as I recall. So yeah, okay, technically 3D Studio wasn't as good as Real 3D because it didn't do ray tracing, and yes, the glass that you rendered in it did suck if you did have to render glass. But overall, the image quality was, I think, actually nicer than Real 3D. That doesn't mean that ray tracing is an inferior technology, because it's certainly not. It is definitely superior to scanline. But the problem was PCs, my Amiga, Macintoshes, they just didn't have the CPU power in those days to do the kind of anti-aliasing that you need to produce a clean image, because basically that render just would have been incredibly slow. So yeah, this is why scanline renderers were just much more practical, really. For me, 3D Studio's killer feature was its speed. You could, because of its extra speed, you could even render like, say, 800 by 600, and that would just take a few minutes. And, a similar kind of image rendered in Real 3D would, probably have taken hours, to be honest. So this kind of made it practical for me to do animations more, because they could now render out in just a few hours. I can recall rendering an animation which was based loosely on the famous Intel advert of the day, which flew around inside a PC showing off, the Intel chip. So we decided to do a similar thing at ICL, and I scanned one of their motherboards from one of their 486 PCs, as I recall. I scanned that into Photoshop, which was another piece of software that they owned. And then I touched up that scan to try and get rid of, speckle highlights and things like that. So it kind of looked more just like a flat color. And then I modeled a motherboard using curves in 3D Studio. And then I actually mapped that texture that I'd scanned onto the motherboard. And I got a really pretty decent looking motherboard. Of course, everything on it was completely flat. Yeah. So then what I did was I modeled all of the chips and the different resistors and all those things. And I basically replicated them. And as I did that, I would then remove the image of the same chip from the texture. And in this way, I built up a really pretty decent looking model of the inside of one of the ICL PCs. And I can remember animating a camera flying around inside. And then I invested quite a lot of time lighting it. And for this, I used a lot of the skills I'd kind of learned when I was doing my photography model in my graphic design course. Part of photography is strangely lighting, or rather paying attention to lighting and then thinking about where lights should be. And on that course, the photography tutors had taught us about lighting, how to light objects to make them look good. So that really came in useful at this point. So when it came to test rendering the inside of my PC, it was amazing because, the rendering was just so fast compared to real 3D. It was taking probably 30, 40 seconds to do the renders. And this meant I could do a 30-second long animation, and I could kick that off at 6 p.m. in the evening and head home. And then the next day when I came into work, it would be ready. And this was pretty crucial because it meant that I could improve the lighting and tweak the animation, and then I could kick it off again that evening and keep on producing these, fast iterations. And I very quickly learned that this was, a critical factor when you're working in 3D. It's that ability to quickly iterate and improve the quality on each render. If the lighting wasn't quite right, it's great where you haven't spent days rendering an animation. It only took overnight. And that gives you the leeway then to improve, maybe the curve of the camera wasn't quite right or the focal length. You just had the time to actually improve those things and get the animation and the lighting and everything perfect before you did a final render. So because of this compelling turnaround rate, I would also then stay in late, after work. I would then try to make my own animations. And as these animations showed more promise, I would even come in to work on the weekends so I could make them and render them and create more ambitious images and animations. I could pop into work on a Saturday, work on an animation, render it while I was there, and then at the end of the day, maybe kick off an animation and then come back in on the Sunday, and it would be ready on the Sunday for me to check out, and I could render that again, have that ready for the Monday, and then obviously, back into work. Of course, my jobs, work, and the renders that I had to do for them came first, but my boss, he didn't mind me experimenting in my own time, as long as, my machine was free for their renders first. I guess the way he thought was that, if I was doing this experimentation, I was obviously improving my skills, and I was, to be fair, and I was learning at a very fast rate, and that would obviously feed back into the work that I was doing for them. So at this point, I was kind of straddling two different technological worlds. On the one hand, I had my wonderful new Amiga 4000 at home, where I was playing, all of these new games, AGA-specific games, and, quite a lot of these were being released. I can remember in particular Frontier, which was the sequel to Elite from the 1980s. This was actually released whilst I was working at ICL. And this really shone because I was playing it on my, my Amiga 4000. And, that machine had a 68030, and it really, really had a much better frame rate on that machine than it had on an Amiga 500. I remember a friend of mine had an Amiga 500, and he actually upgraded, I think, to a 1200 because I think that had a 68020 to try and get a better frame rate in Frontier. But, at that point I was rocking it, with my 68030. So that was really great, being able to play that sort of era-defining game on a machine that actually did it justice. I was also dabbling in multimedia at home still. I was using CanDo, which we talked about in a previous video, the Amiga 1500 video. And of course, I was still rendering out ray-traced images using Real 3D. As I said earlier, ray tracing isn't an inferior technology. It just wasn't really suited to rendering out animations at this point. But I was still dabbling in producing still images on Real 3D and, seeing how far I could take ray tracing on my Amiga at home. Whilst at work, I was learning about PCs, and I was learning about 3D Studio. There was a lot to learn about 3D Studio. I had 3 really thick books. Each book was about 3 centimeters thick. I think there was a book on modeling, there was a book on animation, and there was a book on utilities that came with 3D Studio. So yeah, I was kept very, very busy learning how to use that piece of software. And of course, you know, over time, I was becoming more and more proficient. And this is pretty much how it continued for the next 8 months before once again, opportunity knocked. And this was a big opportunity for me, and I really had to take this opportunity. I had to reach out and grab it with both hands. But anyway, we're not going to talk about that in this video. That's something we'll talk about in the next video, actually, in this series. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers this period in my tech history. But of course, we can't finish off this video without looking at this wonderful Amiga that I have here. So let's do that next. So I've actually brought in the Amiga 2000, and you're probably wondering why I've done that. Well, I thought it was quite important to point out the size difference between the Amiga 2000 and the Amiga 4000. I don't know if you can see that quite clearly, but it's a lot smaller. There's a good reason for that. We'll actually be able to see that a little bit later on. But I should point out as well, there's a hole in the front of the Amiga 2000 right now, and there's a reason for that as well, which is that I'm currently using its GoTech drive, which comes in a 3.5-inch form factor. And I managed to get this bracket off eBay. Very, very lucky to find this, which means that I can actually mount it inside the same bay inside the A2000 and yeah, keep the machine looking aesthetically pleasing. Now, I'm not sure if you come across a GoTech before. I hadn't until recently, well, maybe like a year and a half ago. It's a floppy disk replacement. It uses a USB thumb drive. And the basic concept is that you put all of your disk images onto that USB drive, and then basically you just use the dial on the front of here to choose between different disks. If you restart the machine, this can effectively be your disk 0, and then the machine will actually boot from these disks, which means that you can actually run games directly from emulated floppy disks, which is really cool because if you boot into Workbench, it can actually use up some of your chip RAM, which means they don't run. And the other thing is as well, some of the disks never actually came out as being DOS compatible. So, and what that means is you can't really copy them onto the hard drive, so you need to run them from the floppy disk as well. It's a very, very useful device to have, especially when you're working with a machine which you haven't got fully set up yet, because if you think about this A4000, it may come with software from 30 years ago, and you may want to put a lot more software onto it. And obviously that would be very, very painful to do using real floppy disks. There are 2 reasons for that. Number one, getting the real floppy disks. They're actually quite rare these days. They're becoming increasingly expensive as well when you try to buy just simple blank floppy disks. And you can also buy, obviously, commercial software on floppy disks, you know, games that you might have had back in the day. But the other problem is reliability. These drives are getting very old. The drives themselves tend to carry on working reasonably well as long as you service them and you don't get them the heads dirty. But the other problem is that the floppy disks themselves are degrading, I should say. And that means they just stop working. And what happens sometimes as well is the media on the disks actually gets onto the heads, makes them dirty, and can stop the actual floppy disk drive from working. So it's much easier actually these days to download the software from a website, put them onto a GoTech like this, and then use this as your floppy disk replacement. I still like having floppy disk drives in the machine. I still like having the physical media. Obviously, it's a nostalgic thing, but it's what we had back in the day, and it does take you back to that period when you use them. But like I said, very often it's more practical to have a device like the GoTech. I only have one right now, so I'm actually using it with this machine, which I'll explain about shortly. So let's put that there. What we'll do next is we'll just clear the table and we'll have a look at the A4000 in a little bit more detail. So yeah, this is the A4000, a very attractive machine, I think. I think it's a nicer looking design than the A2000, very much smaller. It's less wide, it has less height. I'm not sure about depth. Probably has a bit less depth as well, actually. Now, let me just move around to the front so I can see this a bit more clearly. This particular machine has been retro-brighted. You can see from the power button there, this hasn't actually been retro-brighted yet. And out of all of the plastics on this machine, this actually didn't get yellowed so much. This is the original color on the floppy disk drive as I received it. Hasn't been cleaned yet and hasn't been retro-brighted. So both this button and this floppy disk drive, they have to be retro-brighted to get them all to match up. Top of the case is a little bit scuffed. There's some paint missing, but that's okay. You know, it's a very old machine and there's nothing too crazy going on there. I just clean it with soap and water. You've got the Amiga badge there, really nicely embossed into the actual plastic itself, which is quite cool. And then to the left of it, you've got the legend 4000, Amiga 4000. And you can see that this particular one, I've been very lucky to get an 040. It does have another bay here for another 3.5-inch floppy disk. And obviously it has a top bay for a 5.25. I'm not sure I'll ever put anything in that. Maybe a CD-ROM drive if I can get one. But I'm not really desperate to get one of those, to be honest. I wasn't that into CD-ROM software back in the day. Most of them were kind of shovelware of older games, so not really that desperate to get one of those. But probably what will happen is in the long run is this disk may stay where it is, or I might move it down and then put a GoTech here, put another GoTech. Because as I said, it's very practical to have a GoTech in an old Amiga like this. What's really nice about these big box Amigas is that you can have your cake and eat it, or rather I should say eat your cake and have it, because you can have a GoTech in there and you can have the original disk drive, and you don't have to bastardize the case, drill holes in it or anything like that to get that in. It just fits into the bay because it's a 3.5-inch drive. Very attractive keyboard, I think. I think it might be the same as the Amiga 3000. This machine and the Amiga 3000 share a lot of similarities. I've retro-brighted it. It's actually looking pretty much perfect, I think. It looks really, really mint. I could have gone a little bit further maybe on this to get it back to more of a sort of very pale beige. But I found with retro-brighting, sometimes it's better to go on the side of caution and not over-brighten it, because that can actually lead to damage. This was an example of a very, very difficult thing to retro-bright because it was very unevenly yellowed. And I'll show you some photographs of the machine before I renovated it so you can see what that was like. Let's take a quick look around the back. Just move the keyboard out of the way for you. We'll swing this around. And oh. Looks like the machine's not there. So look, take the case off. Yeah, it's completely empty. And this is all just hanging here. So why is it like this? Well, when I received this machine, it was actually quite badly damaged. I bought it from somebody in Worcester, which is a city in the west of England. And it's actually going to feature in a future video, so I won't talk about it too much, the situation. But what happened was this young guy was selling a bunch of Amiga kit. And it actually came from a guy who I believe used to work for ITV. ITV is one of the 3 big broadcasting stations in the UK, one of the traditional ones, which has been around since the 50s. And I have to assume that this Amiga was used for television in the Birmingham area. Unfortunately, that particular person had died, as far as I understand it. He'd passed on this machine to this young guy, and it had a lot of broadcast kit, and the young guy just didn't know what to do with it, really. So he was selling it. So it was sold to me as working. Unfortunately, because of the situation, which was that it was in his sort of like dining room in his house, and there was a lot of other equipment there, I didn't really have the luxury of inspecting the machine and turning it on. It was part of a very large bundle. There were like broadcast monitors. There was a broadcast monitor, 2 small monitors, a mixing desks, and lots of other stuff, which, like I said, we'll have a look at in a future video. I got it back here. I was very, very happy to get the machine. It looked like it was in good condition apart from being yellowed. and being quite dirty, which is quite normal. But unfortunately, when I went to turn it on, it didn't work at all. So that was a bit of a sickening moment. Let's move some of this stuff out of the way. And what we'll do next is we'll have a quick look at the actual logic board and the logic boards that came inside it, because it's quite interesting, because it kind of explains the form factor of the machine and how it all fits together. Okay, so this is the Amiga 4000 main logic board. It's not really that evident from this. You need something next to it really to see how big it is, but it's significantly smaller than the A2000 board. And the reason for that is that the Zorro slots are missing. I don't know if you can recognize that. In the center of the board, this is a key feature, you've got the riser slot. So the riser slot is here. And what this is basically doing is it's making the orientation of the Zorro slots from being vertical to being horizontal. So you can imagine, instead of the Zorro slots being part of the logic board like this, instead they actually, I have to flip this actually, flip this around. There we are. It would actually sit like this vertically. So this is one of the reasons why the actual board is so small, and the actual machine in general is quite small. It's taking use of that space above the logic board to change the orientation of the cards so they actually go in sideways. You'll see that it actually has 4 sets of slots on here. And that means that it's actually less, I think it has less slots than the Amiga 2000. But these are Zorro 3 expansion slots. And what that means is, I think they're 32-bit wide. And I think they also support DMA. So for instance, there's a SCSI card you can get for this machine, which runs at, I think, 10 megabytes a second bandwidth. So you can get data off the drive much more quickly compared to the SCSI cards that you would have in the A2000, which ran, I think, only 2.5 megabytes a second. So yeah, significantly faster. Let's have a look at the logic board itself. This is where the memory is. There are 4 slots there for for fast RAM, and the one on the end closest to the riser slot, that's actually the chip RAM slot. Next to it, you have the clock area. Over here, I think you have Alice. Then you have the sound area. This is where the sound logic is. Obviously, not that surprising because it's next to the 2 phono jacks that actually do the audio. The slot, the DB, I think it's a DB25 next to it. That's the video connector. Then you have the keyboard. And over here, I'm not quite sure. I think you have the parallel and serial ports. Yeah. If we go back to the main board, these 2 pin headers here, the one closest to us is the floppy disk drive. I think you can see that on the board. And next to it, we have an IDE connector. So I think this was the same generation of machines as the Amiga 1200, which was also an AGA chipset like this one. And those machines moved to IDE, and I think that was a cost-reducing measure. I think it was felt that the IDE out of the box gave you a pretty decent performance. I mean, that was standard really on PC, so it's not that crazy. Although it was an inferior technology to SCSI, it obviously must have been quite a bit cheaper. And one of the nice things about the Amiga 4000 is because you have that header there, you natively out of the box have IDE hard drive support. Unfortunately, that also meant that you didn't get a SCSI card in the Amiga 4000, which is a bit shocking because it's, you know, the high end of the Amiga range, and it didn't actually come with SCSI. Although, of course, it could support it using one of the Zorro slots, Zorro 3 slots there, as we talked about. And in fact, if you did get a nice SCSI card, you could actually have much faster performance. So that's pretty cool. Over here, we have the 2 ROMs. And then we have the processor slot. So it's very easy to get it, to get muddled up here and call this an accelerator slot. It's not really an accelerator slot because there is no native CPU on this machine. This is actually my CPU. It's a 68040. It runs at 25 megahertz. Actually, if you have a look at that, if that's going to focus there, that clock there, that chip, sorry, that crystal there, is actually running at 50 megahertz, and that gets halved to give you the actual speed of this CPU. It's actually, this machine actually came with two different CPUs. You could get a cheaper one, which had a 6830, and obviously the much more expensive one, the 6840, which I don't think I had at the time. That then plugs pretty much in this orientation into this slot, which makes it a slightly difficult machine to troubleshoot because basically the ROMs here and all these chips are covered up when the machine is running. So if there's a problem with any of these chips, it's going to be very, very difficult to diagnose it, obviously. That white block there, that's the power supply where you plug the power supply in. And I think, you know, these chips in this area here are to do with ID and clock and various other things. Yeah, you know, it's a pretty neat motherboard, logic board. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, damage. If we focus here on this chip, can you see I've been doing bodge work on it? I know it doesn't look great, but believe me, it needed quite a lot of work. This is obviously where the battery was. You can see there's what looks like a kind of, looks like a fluid has drained downwards onto that chip, and that's exactly what happened. Electrolyte came out of the Varta battery that used to be there, and the machine, I think, was lying on its side because it looked like that went directly down onto that chip. And on the right-hand side of the chip, it actually completely removed some of the pads on the logic board, which meant that this chip wasn't actually connected correctly to the whole logic, you know, all the traces on this machine. When I turned it on, it just wasn't working. It was actually just a black screen and it didn't respond whatsoever. If I flip this over, on the back, you can see there are some bodge wires here that I've done. I checked these out, and this here, I'm going to look at the center here. This is actually the area where that battery damage was. I think you can see it's come through to this side. And what I found was there were some connections over here which just weren't connected anymore. And they go all the way over here to these SIM slots. And I think there's still a problem here because I'm having problems with the fast RAM. I can't actually get the fast RAM to work. So it looks like, you know, these connections here probably would be where I need to focus on next, actually make sure they're still okay. There's also a bunch of different bodge wires there. I don't know if you can see that going between the two different SIM slots there. That's actually where the corrosion destroyed those traces, and there was no continuity between those two slots. If I turn it back over again, what that meant was basically these traces here, these pins here were not connected to these pins, and they actually run in parallel. These SIMs are connected together with, I think it's 8 separate connections, which actually go to this chip here. And I know all of this because I'm in the process of trying to fix it at the moment. I'm not an electronics whiz kid. I'm learning, and I'm trying to follow the lead of other people out there who do it much better than I do. I've just purchased an oscilloscope, so I'm in the process of trying to see what's going on. There is actually some activity in this chip, which is a new one, which I bought. And I've checked it in a diagnostic piece of software, and actually, most of the stuff in that area is actually working. The real-time clock is working, and the clock circuit seems to be okay. So, how am I going to try and fix this? Well, I'm going to check the connections on the underside, because obviously the fast RAM here, which is these first closest four slots, that they're not actually working. There are, you know, there's power going to these slots. There's signals going to the slots. So there's just one thing missing maybe, or a chip somewhere that's blown. And that's probably causing the problem. And I'm actually in the process of waiting for some EEPROMs to come from China. What that will allow me to do is to make my own diagrams. And the diagrams basically allow you to run the machine with hardly anything working. And it should then give me, hopefully, some kind of diagnostic, which will be a smoking gun, which will then allow me to get the chip RAM working. When it's fully working, I'll end up with a machine with 16 megabytes of RAM. I do have the SIMs. They all seem to be 4 megabytes, so that's 16 meg. The SIM on the end there is the chip RAM, and that's actually working fine. I have 2 megabytes of chip RAM, so the machine does actually run. But unfortunately, it's absolutely dog slow because it doesn't have any fast RAM, which seems to be pretty important to its fast execution. What else can I say about this machine? Well, yeah, the biggest feature, I suppose, was the AGA chipset. That was introduced with this machine in the Amiga 1200, and that gave it super VGA-like capabilities, which was a big thing. You know, the Amiga at this point had really lagged behind the PC. The PC had 256 colors in most games for, by this point, about 5 years, and the Amiga didn't. You know, it started off way in advance of the PC, but once VGA graphics came out, it really started to fall behind, and by this point, it was lagging very badly. So the AGA chipset took a bit too long to come out, really, but once it did come out, it was an amazing, you know, catch-up, really. Unfortunately, I didn't get to use this machine for that long. I did try out some of the AGA games. A lot of the games were mainly actually reissues in some cases of older games, where they used the extra colors to make the games look even better. I mean, to be fair, the Amiga from the 500 onwards never looked really that bad. It was a great machine. But with the AGA chipset, you know, you could have 256 colors in quite high resolutions as well. So that's one of the reasons why this machine has 2 megabytes of chip RAM. It's because it needs it. It needs it to run in general, but it also needs it for the higher resolutions that you can actually run. Obviously, you could plug in one of the third-party retargetable graphics cards, and that would give this machine even better capabilities, you know, 24-bit color and so on. But just out of the box, it was a great machine. This particular one is a 68040. It has the AGA chipset. I'm thinking about getting a SCSI card, hopefully, eventually. There's a particular one. It's originally a Commodore-made card. It has DMA, which means it has direct memory access, meaning it can get straight into memory without having to arbitrate with the CPU and do transfer of data very quickly. And that actually is much faster than the ID and the SCSI, which you would have had with an Amiga 2000. So with that, you're going to have a sort of native, real Amiga 4000, nothing new, nothing sort of, you know, period that isn't period correct, which is going to be, you know, it's running as fast as it can. There's one last thing I want to show you before we finish off here. I just want to show you this card which came with the machine. I don't know if you can see that there. It's called the G2 Amiga Image Engine, Issue 2. I don't really know what this card does. Not really got round to checking it out yet, because obviously I need to get the machine working in general before I do that. It does seem to be, well, it's a chunky old thing, isn't it? Look at the memory there. That's one set of memory. I think they're called zips. And then it also has a SIM slot for some other kind of memory. Double-sided. So I don't know how big that is. Maybe that's 4 megabytes or 8 megabytes of RAM. And then you've got all this RAM here as well. It's some kind of, you know, graphics buffer, I think, probably 24-bit. I hope it's something like a Picasso, although I've never heard of it. So it could be more of the kind of thing that you would use on a TV station where you load in a very high resolution or a number of images, and then you can basically display them on a monitor. I have a feeling that what the great thing is about this card is that it can load those images into that RAM, and even when the machine gets turned off, it actually stores those images. So you can basically come in every day and just turn the machine on and just start working, and it can do its job. So I have to assume that this particular Amiga 4000 was a working beast, and it was used, obviously, when the owner was working at ITV. Probably was used for broadcast, so that's pretty cool. You know, this would have actually been seen on TV, maybe even at the time when I was in Birmingham, although I don't think so. I think I left Birmingham just as this machine came out, so it's possible I wouldn't have actually seen that. But yeah, really looking forward to actually trying out this card and seeing if it's working. Fingers crossed that it is. There's a bunch of kit that actually comes with this as well. Like I said, there's a broadcast monitor and 2 small broadcast monitors, and then there's a breakout box with sliders, and all very professional. So it'll be interesting to see what exactly this does. And it might be tricky to set up, you know, because it's going to require some kind of analog signals probably, which are more difficult to set up these days. I might even have to feed the image from one Amiga, which can generate those signals, into this Amiga, and then maybe overlay some graphics. That'd be quite a cool thing to do in a future video, eh? That'd be quite nice to, you know, see what this was actually meant to be used for. So yeah, the Amiga 4000, fantastic machine. Hopefully I will get this fully working at some point. It's running fine right now. It's running slowly. If I can't get that chip RAM working, there is one more alternative. There are modern memory cards that you can get. They're Zorro 3 cards, and they state that they run faster than the native memory on the board. I don't know if that's true. I wouldn't really worry about that too much. What I would worry about is if they run at all. Because this machine, without any fast RAM, doesn't run very fast. It actually runs really slowly. So I think they cost about 80 euros, something like that. So what I might do is, if I can't get the fast RAM working, if it does turn out to be something incredibly esoteric, like one pin, one trace somewhere that I can't spot, and it just needs that, and then it works, that's always a fallback. I could always get that card. I think it has 256 megabytes of RAM on it, which is crazy. But that's obviously a alternative to try and getting the native fast RAM working. So yeah, the Amiga 4000, what a fantastic machine. It's just a real shame that I never really got to sort of having it for an extended period of time and really getting some really good use out of this machine. I bought it at a time when I was a young adult, fresh out of college. I started to earn money. I had some money in my pocket, didn't really have any outgoing, so I just decided to get the ultimate machine that I could get for that time. And then, of course, I was working with ICL, and over time, it became obvious there that I needed to get like a 486. That was kind of where things were moving. But for now, I had this fantastic machine, an AGA Amiga 4000, the sort of best machine really you could get at the time. So yeah, I was very, very lucky to actually have one of these back in the day. I don't think it was a 68040, as I said. I think that would have been probably out of my price range at that time. I think it was a 68030, but even so, it was almost certainly faster than the Amiga 2000 68030 I had, because it probably would have had a faster clock speed. And then on top of that, the AGA chipset was a better chipset. The whole architecture of the machine was more advanced than the A2000. So yeah, it would have been a much more refined experience. It was definitely a smaller machine, which made it more practical for where I was living, because I was living in a room which was much smaller than the studio, really. It just had room for a bed, and then for you to get out of the bed and a door, and I think it had a wardrobe, and that was it. There wasn't really much space in there at all, really. So yeah, it was a fantastic experience to have this machine, to achieve something, to have what I wanted. But it's kind of bittersweet, because we'll explore in the next video what happened next with the A4000. Don't worry, nothing bad happened to the machine. But all I'll say is I didn't really have it for that much time. We'll look into that in the next video as to why that was the case. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've certainly enjoyed making it. It's a real trip through memory lane, and trying to dredge up the memories of exactly what happened and when. It's quite difficult, actually, after all this time. So it's been a little bit sort of autobiographical, having to think about my life and working at ICL and places like that. It was a really good place, actually, really nice people. Really enjoyed my time at ICL. It was a very good employer. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please obviously click the like button. That really helps grow the channel. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this, then please subscribe. Obviously, then you'll get notified when I release more videos. Please tell your friends about the channel and these videos if you really like them. Pass on the word, and hopefully, grow the channel that way. So yeah, let's see you hopefully in the next video, where we're going to explore what happened next in my tech history.